standing alone in a small room, staring at a strange metal device on the table. His hands are shaking. Not from fear, from hope. For years, everyone told him this was impossible. Tonight, he is about to say one sentence into a wire, and if it works, the entire world is about to change forever. But what almost nobody knows is why he was chasing this dream in the first place. And it has nothing to do with machines at all. His name was Alexander Graham Bell, and before he ever touched a wire, he was just a boy, watching someone he loved slowly disappear into silence. His mother was going deaf. Slowly, over years, her world grew quieter and quieter. Young Alexander would sit close to her, speaking directly into her forehead, because the bones there could still carry a little sound. He learned something most children never think about. Sound wasn't just something you hear, it was something you could almost touch, if you knew how. He grew up in Scotland, in a house full of questions about sound and speech. His father taught people how to speak clearly. His grandfather did too. It was almost like the family had one shared mission, passed down like a name. But Alexander didn't just want to help people speak better. He wanted to understand sound itself. As a teenager, he built strange little machines in his spare time, trying to make sound visible, trying to make it move through wire the way water moves through a pipe. Then tragedy struck. Not once, but twice. Both of his brothers died young, from the same disease quietly spreading through their family. His parents feared they would lose their last son too. So the family made a hard choice. They packed up their entire life in Scotland and moved across the ocean, first to Canada, then to America, hoping a new climate would keep Alexander alive. In America, Alexander found work teaching deaf children how to speak. He wasn't just good at it, he loved it. He believed every person deserved a way to be heard, even if their ears couldn't hear back. One of his students was a young girl named Mabel, who had lost her hearing to illness as a child. Years later, she would become his wife. But that story was still ahead of him. At night, after long days of teaching, Alexander would disappear into his workshop. He was chasing an idea that most people thought was pure fantasy. He wanted to send the human voice through a wire, the same way telegraph companies were already sending short beeps and clicks across entire countries. Everyone told him it made no sense. Telegraph machines sent dots and dashes. They didn't send voices. Voices were too complicated, too alive, too human to travel through a thin copper wire. But Alexander didn't listen. He partnered with a skilled young mechanic named Thomas Watson, a man who could actually build the strange machines Alexander kept sketching late at night. For months, they worked side by side in a cramped, cluttered workshop filled with wires, magnets, and half-finished devices. Progress was painfully slow. Most nights ended in failure. A wire would spark, a membrane would tear, a sound would come through as nothing more than a meaningless buzz. Money was another problem. Alexander had 2 investors backing him, but they were growing impatient. They had put their money into a machine that could send telegraph messages faster, not some far-fetched dream about talking wires. They gave him a deadline. Either he showed real progress soon, or the funding would disappear completely. The pressure was crushing. Alexander was stretched between teaching by day and inventing by night, running on almost no sleep, chasing an idea the whole world still doubted. Then, on March 10, 1876, everything changed in an instant. Alexander was working in one room, Watson in another, each connected only by a thin wire and 2 crude devices. While testing the equipment, Alexander accidentally spilled acid from a battery onto his clothes. In pain and startled, he shouted out without even thinking, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." But in the next room, Thomas Watson froze. He wasn't just hearing noise through the wire. He was hearing actual words, clear, unmistakable words, carried through a wire from one room to another. Watson dropped what he was doing and ran, bursting into the room, breathless, staring at Alexander, like he had just witnessed a miracle. Because he had. The telephone was born, not in a moment of triumph, but in a moment of accidental pain. Just hours before that breakthrough, Alexander had filed a patent application for his invention, describing a method for transmitting sound through electricity. What almost nobody knew was that another inventor, a man named Elisha Gray, filed a strikingly similar idea at the very same patent office. But officially, the patent was his, and that single piece of paper would change the course of human history. Word spread quickly, but belief spread slowly. Newspapers mocked the idea. Respected scientists called it a parlor trick, a novelty with no real future. Western Union, the biggest telegraph company in the country, was offered the rights to the telephone patent for a small fraction of what it would eventually be worth. They turned it down, convinced this strange invention was nothing more than a passing curiosity. It was one of the most expensive mistakes in business history. Alexander didn't stop to argue with his critics. Instead, he set out to prove them wrong in the most public way possible. In 1876, he brought his invention to the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, a massive celebration of 100 years of American innovation. His telephone was tucked away in a small corner, almost overlooked entirely, surrounded by flashier, more impressive-looking machines. For most of the event, almost nobody noticed it. Then, on the final day, the exposition's judges happened to walk past his booth. Among them was Dom Pedro II, the Emperor of Brazil, who had actually met Alexander before through his work teaching deaf students. Curious, the Emperor picked up the receiver and held it to his ear. Alexander, in another room, spoke a simple line from a famous play into the transmitter. The Emperor's face changed instantly. He nearly dropped the receiver in shock, turned to the crowd, and shouted words that would echo through history. "My God, it talks." That single moment changed everything. Word of the demonstration spread like wildfire. Suddenly, the strange little device in the corner was the most talked about invention at the entire exposition. Investors who had once doubted him were now desperate to be part of it. Within just a few years, telephone lines began stretching across cities, then states, connecting voices across distances that once felt impossible to bridge. But success brought a new kind of battle. As the telephone grew more valuable, other inventors and companies began claiming they deserved credit too. Alexander found himself dragged into hundreds of legal battles, fighting again and again to defend his invention in court. It became one of the most fiercely contested patents in American history. Despite the constant pressure, Alexander won nearly every single case, but the fighting left him exhausted and increasingly detached from the very invention that made him famous. In fact, later in life, Alexander admitted something surprising. He didn't even like having a telephone in his own study. He found the constant ringing intrusive, distracting him from the deeper scientific work he still wanted to pursue. The man who gave the world instant voice communication preferred silence when he was trying to think. It was one of the strange, quiet contradictions that followed him for the rest of his life. Because Alexander was never a man who wanted to stop at just one invention. He spent decades afterward working on flight, on hydrofoil boats that could skim across water at incredible speeds, on metal detectors, and on devices designed to help the deaf community he never stopped caring about. In fact, when President James Garfield was shot in 1881, Alexander rushed to help, using an early metal detector device to try locating the bullet inside the president's body. The device worked in tests, but interference from the metal bed frame in the room caused it to fail during the actual search. It was one of the quiet, painful near misses of his career, a reminder that even brilliant minds don't win every single time. Through it all, one thing never changed. His devotion to the deaf community remained constant his entire life. He continued teaching, funding research, and advocating for better education for deaf children, long after he had already become one of the most famous inventors on Earth. For Alexander, it was never really about fame or fortune. It was about connection, about giving people a way to reach each other across silence, in every form that silence could take. On August 2nd, 1922, Alexander Graham Bell passed away at his home in Nova Scotia, with his beloved wife Mabel by his side. On the day of his funeral, something remarkable happened. Telephone service across the entire United States and Canada was paused for 1 full minute of silence, as a tribute to the man who gave the world its voice. For that 1 minute, millions of phone lines that once carried endless conversations fell completely silent, in honor of the boy who once dreamed of turning sound into something you could see. Today, we carry that same dream in our pockets, in the phones that connect us to people across oceans in an instant. Most of us never think about where that connection came from, or the quiet, personal pain that first inspired it. Alexander Graham Bell didn't set out to build an empire. He set out to hear his mother's voice a little more clearly, and to help others do the same. If his story moved you, let me know in the comments which part surprised you the most. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because there's another one waiting for you right here.